Today, a question involving Donald Trump, the White House, and January 20th is quietly returning to serious discussion in Washington. Not because anyone is predicting chaos, and not because the United States is facing something unprecedented, but because recent political history has reminded people of a simple truth. Institutions are only fully understood when they're tested at the edges. I'm Emily Carter, a U.S. political and global affairs analyst, breaking down how power moves beyond the headlines. The question itself sounds dramatic, but it's actually very narrow. What would happen if a sitting president challenged the transfer of power after an election? Not through speeches, not through rallies, not through social media, but through courts, legal filings, and competing claims of authority inside the U.S. government. To understand this, you have to separate politics from process. The United States does not rely on goodwill to manage presidential transitions. It relies on law. Under the 20th Amendment, a president's term ends at noon on January 20th. That deadline is automatic. It doesn't pause for disputes, it doesn't wait for consensus, and it doesn't change based on who occupies the White House. That applies to Donald Trump, it applies to Joe Biden, and it applies to any future president. What many people misunderstand is that the transfer of power is not controlled by one decision maker. It's distributed. Congress certifies the election. Federal courts resolve legal challenges. The military follows lawful civilian command. And federal agencies operate under statute, not personal loyalty. This structure exists to prevent uncertainty from concentrating in one place. And that's where most public discussions go wrong. They imagine a single dramatic moment. In reality, power shifts quietly through recognition, procedure, and administrative control. Understanding that difference is essential because it explains why experts don't focus on hypothetical standoffs. They focus on process. And that brings us to the historical record. This question isn't new. The United States has faced contested transfers of power before, just not often. In 1876, the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ended without a clear winner. Multiple states submitted conflicting electoral slates. For months, the country didn't know who the next president would be, but the crisis didn't end in force. It ended through Congress, negotiation, and institutional compromise. The result wasn't perfect, but the system held. More than a century later, another test came. In 1974, Richard Nixon did not leave office because soldiers removed him. He left because the Supreme Court, Congress, and his own party withdrew recognition. Once that happened, authority evaporated. Power transferred without a confrontation. That pattern matters because it shows how authority actually works in practice. More recently, after the 2020 election, the legal system was tested again. Dozens of lawsuits were filed. State courts ruled. Federal courts ruled. And eventually, the Supreme Court declined to intervene further. Once those legal avenues ended, institutions moved forward. Not because everyone agreed, but because process was exhausted. This is why constitutional scholars rarely focus on personalities. They focus on institutions, because when institutions align, authority becomes clear, even in politically charged moments. This is where confusion usually sets in. Authority in the United States does not come from belief. It comes from recognition. Federal agencies take direction based on law. The Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security do not respond to competing claims. They respond to lawful authority recognized by courts and certified by Congress. The military in particular operates under strict rules governing civilian control, but that control must be lawful. If competing claims exist, institutions don't guess. They look to process, court rulings, certification, statutory deadlines. That's why January 20th matters. At noon, authority either transfers or it expires. Not symbolically, legally. And this is why experts emphasize that the most important decisions happen quietly, inside agencies, inside legal offices, inside administrative systems. So here's the question I want you to think about. If power depends on recognition, not rhetoric, where do you think real authority actually resides? Share your thoughts in the comments because how people answer that question shapes how every political crisis is interpreted. The takeaway here is not fear, and it's not certainty, it's structure. The U.S. system was designed to assume that disagreement would happen. What it does not assume is that disagreement alone can override law. Presidents come and go, institutions persist. And when institutions agree on process, transfers of power occur, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes slowly, but lawfully. That doesn't mean the system can't be stressed, but it does mean power in the United States is procedural, not personal. Understanding that distinction changes how you read headlines. It changes how you interpret statements. And it changes how you assess risk during moments of political tension. If stories like this matter to you, and you want calm, clear analysis that explains how power actually works beyond the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It helps these conversations reach the people who need them, and it lets me know to keep going deeper.